Discovery in the shadows. Ethan Caldwell had always believed that wealth could shield him from the harsher truths of life. The sprawling acres of his Montana ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with grazing cattle and ancient oak trees, a picture of prosperity that outsiders envied. Yet, in the quiet of his own home, that wealth often felt like a gilded cage. The grand halls of the Caldwell estate were cold in winter, and Margaret, his wife, moved through them like a distant memory, her smiles polite but rare, her words clipped and measured. Ethan had grown accustomed to silence. At dinners, in the evenings, even in the soft spaces between their carefully rehearsed conversations. It was on one such morning, while riding alone across his northern pastures, that he noticed something unusual. A thin wisp of smoke curled up from behind a cluster of pines on land he had long assumed uninhabited. At first, he thought it might be a campfire left by a hunter or perhaps a stray camper seeking refuge. But something about the slow, deliberate curl of the smoke pulled him closer. Ethan's curiosity had always bordered on obsession. He could not ignore the anomaly. Adjusting his hat against the sharp winter sun, he guided his horse through the brush toward the source. The cabin that emerged from the trees was older than most of the ranch's structures, weathered and sagging, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were grimy, the wood bleached by sun and wind. Yet there was life here, an unmistakable warmth radiated from within. And there she was, Lin Mei. She moved quietly, her dark hair tied back, a figure of calm and dignity as she stirred something over a modest fire. Ethan watched from the edge of the trees, unsure whether to announce himself or retreat. Lin Mei's presence was a puzzle. She had been living unnoticed on his property, yet there was an undeniable aura about her that demanded respect rather than pity. She was not helpless. She did not glance up, seemingly accustomed to solitude. And in that moment, Ethan felt the first stirrings of fascination that had nothing to do with desire. It was the curiosity of someone who had encountered something profoundly unfamiliar in a familiar world. Returning home that evening, Ethan's mind was restless. Margaret was in the kitchen, arranging cutlery with her usual precision, her face pale in the soft glow of the lamps. She smiled politely, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the pang of a connection that had once existed. But as quickly as it came, it vanished. The emptiness remained, and alongside it, a creeping guilt, unnameable yet insistent, that he had been chasing wealth and appearances while neglecting the simpler truths of companionship. The next morning, he returned. Lin Mei noticed him immediately, though her expression gave nothing away. She did not flee. She did not invite him in. Instead, she maintained a quiet vigilance, observing him as much as he observed her. There was a symmetry in their encounter, a silent understanding that each was an intruder in the other's world. Ethan offered her food, bread, dried meat, coffee, small gestures, tentative bridges toward trust. Lin Mei accepted with the same restraint she had shown upon first meeting. The exchange was more than sustenance. It was the beginning of an unspoken connection, fragile yet undeniable. As days passed, Ethan found reasons to check on the cabin. Repairs were minor, a broken window, a leaning doorframe, but they provided him an excuse to linger, to observe, to talk without speaking. Lin Mei, in turn, shared stories of her past in small fragments, a family she had left behind, the tragedies she had endured, the choice to isolate herself in a world that had been unkind. Ethan listened. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of being understood, of being seen for something beyond his money and title. Yet beneath the calm exterior, a tension coiled. Ethan could not help but think of Margaret, her distant warmth now a stark contrast to the quiet presence of Lin Mei. Questions he had long avoided began to surface. Had he truly married for love or for convenience? Had he been blind to the cracks in his own life because they were easier to ignore? And if he had been blind, what other truths might he be missing? By the end of the week, Ethan rode back to the cabin one last time before sunset, a chill in the air that seemed to echo his own inner restlessness. Lin Mei was there, tending the small fire, her gaze occasionally meeting his. For a brief moment, the world outside, his wealth, his home, his obligations, fell away. And in that shared silence, Ethan realized that this encounter, simple though it appeared, had shifted something fundamental within him. As he rode back across the fields, the sun dipping below the horizon, Ethan understood one thing with painful clarity. Life on the surface had remained unchanged, but beneath it, everything had shifted. A discovery had been made, not just of a woman in an old cabin, but of the hollowness in his own life. And he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he could not unsee it. The unspoken bond. The days that followed Ethan's first encounters with Lin Mei blurred together in a rhythm both unexpected and unsettling. Each morning, he rose with a sense of purpose he had long forgotten, not to inspect his wealth or plan cattle shipments, but to ride through the forest toward the cabin that had become, in some indefinable way, the center of his attention. Lin Mei remained as composed as ever, tending her modest hearth and the small garden she had coaxed from the rocky soil. She spoke little, yet every gesture carried a quiet precision that revealed more than words ever could. Ethan quickly realized that these visits were not simply about curiosity or the novelty of discovery. There was a void in him, one shaped by years of emotional neglect and the cold distance of Margaret's affection, that Lin Mei seemed to fill. He did not consciously seek romantic entanglement. At least he told himself that, but the intimacy of shared silences, the trust implied in small exchanges, and the raw simplicity of her life ignited feelings he had buried under the trappings of wealth and routine. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her pattern of absence. Evenings spent together were curt, measured, punctuated by polite conversation that left Ethan feeling hollow. Her laughter, once familiar and comforting, now echoed with a subtle falseness, as though it belonged to a stranger inhabiting her body. Ethan began to notice the small omissions, calls unanswered, whispered phone conversations, clothing faintly scented with perfume he did not recognize. It was as though the very walls of his home bore witness to a quiet betrayal, a slow unraveling he had refused to see until now. At the cabin, Lin Mei shared fragments of her past in tentative gestures. A photograph, faded at the edges, of her family in Shanghai, a hand-carved figurine of a crane she had carried across continents, a journal, its pages inscribed with memories she had never spoken aloud. Ethan listened without interruption, absorbing the weight of her experiences, feeling in them a resonance with his own hidden loneliness. Their conversations, sparse and deliberate, created an intimacy that transcended the physical. Every glance, every shared task, became a bridge spanning the gulf between two lives once isolated and now inexplicably intertwined. One afternoon, as a sudden snowstorm settled over the land, Ethan found himself helping Lin Mei secure a broken window shutter. Their hands brushed briefly as they lifted the wood together, a fleeting contact that lingered longer in his mind than it should. Lin Mei looked up at him, eyes calm, unreadable, and yet there was a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding. Neither spoke of it, for words were unnecessary, but the moment lingered, a quiet pulse beneath the surface of their growing bond. Ethan's thoughts increasingly wandered to what he had long denied: the insufficiency of his marriage, the cold formalities that masked Margaret's indifference, and the awakening he felt in Lin Mei's presence. There was an unspoken question forming in his mind, one he dared not articulate aloud. If he found the emotional connection he had been missing here, what did that mean for the life he had built, for the vows he had sworn? At the same time, he observed Lin Mei carefully, noting her independence, the way she moved through the cabin with ease, how she had cultivated a life of self-sufficiency in isolation. She did not need him, and yet she allowed him to help. The dynamic unsettled him. He had spent years wielding influence and wealth, commanding attention and obedience, only to discover that here, in the quiet of a forgotten cabin, the rules he had long lived by no longer applied. Evenings became a time of reflection. Ethan would ride back toward the mansion, snow crunching beneath his boots, and feel the stark contrast between his home and the cabin. The grandeur of wealth now seemed hollow compared to the authenticity he had glimpsed in Lin Mei's world. In his mind, he replayed each interaction, each gesture, searching for significance, seeking reassurance that his emotional stirrings were not misplaced. By the end of the week, Ethan's visits had solidified into routine. He brought supplies, repaired what needed fixing, and lingered longer than necessity required. Lin Mei did not encourage this. She maintained her boundaries, never inviting him beyond what comfort allowed. And yet, the presence of another human being, someone who observed him without judgment, who shared in silence what he could not express, was intoxicating. That evening, as the first stars pierced the cold winter sky, Ethan mounted his horse to leave, pausing at the edge of the cabin clearing. Lin Mei stood at the doorway, the firelight casting a soft glow around her figure. Neither spoke, yet their mutual recognition of what had begun hung heavily in the air. Ethan felt a thrill he had not experienced in years, tempered by guilt, fear, and anticipation. He knew that the boundaries he had always respected were shifting, and that the next choices he made could not be undone. As he rode back through the snow-laden trees, a quiet determination settled within him. He did not yet know what the future held, but he understood that something fundamental had changed. The discovery of Lin Mei's existence was no longer the defining event. It was the emotion she had stirred within him, the question she had forced him to confront about love, loyalty, and longing. And in that realization, Ethan sensed both the danger and the allure that lay ahead. Shadows of betrayal. The chill of winter had begun to settle deeply into the Caldwell estate. Even the grand hallways seemed colder than usual, and the faint crackle of the fireplace could no longer mask the emptiness that had taken root. Ethan's thoughts, once easily dominated by work and routine, now circled relentlessly around two realities: the quiet presence of Lin Mei in the cabin and the growing awareness of Margaret's absence in his own home. What had once been tolerable silence now pressed against him with the weight of accusation. It was on a gray afternoon, while reviewing ledger books in his study, that Ethan noticed the first undeniable signs. Margaret's handwriting appeared on notes he hadn't seen before, appointments that made no mention of him, unexplained expenditures, and the subtle scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering on her belongings. Each discovery compounded a gnawing certainty. The cold distance, the whispered phone conversations, the polite but empty smiles were not mere indifference. She had been living a secret life, and he had been blind to it for years. The realization struck him not with immediate anger, but with a hollow, aching disbelief. How could the woman he had trusted, the one who had shared his life for over a decade, so quietly divide herself from him? He paced the study, the rhythmic tapping of his boots on the wooden floor echoing his internal unrest. Memories of their early years flashed unbidden. Shared laughter, impromptu dances in the kitchen, quiet nights spent talking of dreams and impossibilities. Each recollection was a bitter reminder of what had eroded over time, replaced by distance and omission. Seeking clarity, or perhaps absolution, Ethan rode to the cabin that evening. The forest was silent beneath the weight of freshly fallen snow, the path obscured yet familiar. Lin Mei was tending her modest fire when he arrived, her expression calm, as if she had sensed his inner turmoil without needing words. Ethan could barely speak. The magnitude of betrayal pressed on him too heavily. All he could do was hand her some supplies, the simplest of gestures, and then retreat to the cabin's threshold, where he could stare into the fire and gather the scattered fragments of his composure. Lin Mei's presence was a paradox. She offered neither advice nor judgment, yet her quiet attentiveness created a sanctuary where Ethan could confront the dissonance in his life. He found himself confessing, in fragmented thoughts, the loneliness, the neglect, and the unspoken suspicions about Margaret. Lin Mei listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes reflecting understanding but never pity. There was no manipulation here, no seduction, only a mirror for the truths Ethan had refused to confront. That night, As the wind howled through the trees, Ethan remained at the cabin longer than usual. The intimacy that had grown between them now bore the weight of his guilt. He recognized that his visits were no longer purely about curiosity or concern. He was seeking solace from someone who offered honesty where his marriage had offered none. The realization unsettled him profoundly, for he understood the precarious edge upon which he now balanced. Every smile Lin Mei allowed, every quiet gesture of trust, was a temptation he could not fully resist. Returning home after dark, Ethan found Margaret in the drawing room, a letter clutched in her hand, her composure flawless. She smiled at him, but the warmth was absent, replaced by the carefully measured charm he had learned to mistrust. In her eyes, Ethan glimpsed the secret he had uncovered earlier, and the truth of it settled like a stone in his chest. Margaret's betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a palpable reality. The distance he had always tolerated now transformed into an unmistakable chasm. Ethan lay awake that night, the fire in the hearth reduced to embers, the house around him silent. He replayed every interaction with Margaret, every long dinner of polite words, every fleeting glance that had once comforted him but now seemed like a reminder of absence. And then he replayed the cabin. The warmth of Lin Mei's fire, the quiet trust between them, the unspoken connection that neither required nor demanded explanation. For the first time in years, he felt fully alive, even as he recognized the moral peril in his awakening. The following morning, Ethan made his decision, though he could not yet articulate it. He would continue to see Lin Mei, but not out of desire for betrayal. Rather, he sought understanding, clarity, and the chance to confront truths long ignored. Margaret's actions had shattered the illusions that had kept him complacent, and the solitude of the cabin offered him a path toward reflection. In this choice lay both danger and liberation, a duality he could neither dismiss nor fully embrace. By the week's end, Ethan had walked a fine line between loyalty and self-preservation. Every visit to the cabin, every moment spent in Lin Mei's presence, heightened the awareness of what he had lost and what he might gain. The central conflict, the pull between marital duty and emotional truth, had now become impossible to ignore. He understood, with a weighty certainty, that the decisions he made in the coming days would define not only his relationships, but the very contours of his own identity. And so, as he prepared for another ride toward the forest, the snow still fresh under his boots and the winter sky a pale gray, Ethan Caldwell felt a tension within him that was at once exhilarating and terrifying. The discovery of betrayal had opened doors he could not close, and the unspoken bond with Lin Mei had become both a sanctuary and a challenge. He knew, with a clarity that left him breathless, that the next chapter of his life would not be written quietly, and that the choices before him would have consequences far beyond the confines of his estate. Choices in the winter light. The sun rose pale over the Caldwell estate, casting long, brittle shadows across the snow-covered fields. Ethan Caldwell sat astride his horse at the edge of the property, the air crisp and biting, and his mind heavier than it had ever been. Each breath he drew seemed to carry the weight of months of silence, distance, and hidden truths. The discoveries of Lin Mei and Margaret had fractured his world, leaving him with choices he could neither ignore nor postpone. Ethan's thoughts turned first to Margaret. She moved through the house with the same grace she always had, yet her presence felt alien, distant, even threatening in its familiarity. He had confronted her in private, gently at first, then with a quiet intensity that betrayed his hurt. Margaret had offered no apology that felt real, no explanation that satisfied the void her absence had created. The marriage that had once seemed unassailable now lay exposed, a fragile skeleton of obligations and unspoken resentments. Ethan realized that love alone, in its absence, could not restore what had been broken. In contrast, Lin Mei remained a constant in the midst of emotional chaos. The cabin, though modest and weathered, had become a sanctuary for reflection, a place where Ethan could examine his desires and fears without pretense. Each visit revealed more of her strength, her resilience, and her dignity, qualities that stirred not only admiration but also the troubling awareness of his own shortcomings. Yet Lin Mei had never asked for anything from him beyond companionship and understanding. She offered presence, not possession, respect, not obligation. The tension between these two worlds, his failing marriage and the unexpected bond with Lin Mei, had reached a point where avoidance was no longer possible. Ethan knew he could no longer ride the line between duty and longing. The first step, he realized, was to confront the truths he had been avoiding. That Margaret's betrayal was real, and that his emotional awakening with Lin Mei was undeniable. Neither choice was simple, and neither came without consequence. Ethan approached the mansion that morning with a mixture of dread and resolve. Margaret was in the drawing room, her expression carefully neutral, as if she sensed the conversation to come. Words were difficult, heavy with unspoken emotion. Ethan spoke first, calmly but with firmness, outlining what he had discovered, how her actions had affected him, and why the life they had built together no longer aligned with the person he had become. Margaret's face shifted through fleeting emotions, surprise, defensiveness, even fleeting remorse, but Ethan remained steady. The conversation ended with no dramatic confrontation, no theatrics, only a quiet acknowledgement that their marriage had run its course. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Ethan rode toward the cabin. Lin Mei was there, tending the small fire as always, her calm composure a stark contrast to the turmoil he carried within. He dismounted and stood quietly, taking in the scene. The simplicity of her life, the warmth of the hearth, and the way she existed fully within herself. For the first time, Ethan felt clarity. He was no longer seeking refuge from his life or his mistakes. He was seeking honesty, both with himself and with those around him. "I've resolved what I needed to," Ethan said softly, not looking directly at her. He gestured toward the cabin, toward the fire, toward the quiet intimacy they shared. "It's not about escaping anything anymore. It's about understanding, about being truthful with myself." Lin Mei nodded, her expression steady but not without warmth. There was no need for declarations, no need for grand gestures. Ethan understood that love, when it was genuine, required patience and respect, not possession or drama. And in that moment, he felt a profound sense of liberation, as if the weight of unspoken fears had lifted from his shoulders. Winter settled fully over the ranch and the forest, snow blanketing the fields, transforming the landscape into a place of stillness and reflection. Ethan spent the evening at the cabin, helping Lin Mei with small repairs, sharing quiet moments of conversation and silence. He knew that the road ahead would be complicated, that societal judgment and personal reflection would continue to test him. Yet for the first time in years, he felt aligned with his own truth, a life lived authentically, not out of obligation, guilt, or expectation. By the time the stars pierced the winter sky, Ethan realized that the discovery that had begun this journey, the Chinese woman living quietly in the abandoned cabin, had given him more than companionship or temptation. It had offered insight, perspective, and the courage to confront the realities of his life. Margaret remained part of his past. Their marriage formally concluded, but the lessons he carried were enduring. Lin Mei remained a presence not defined by ownership or dependence, but by shared humanity and quiet understanding. Ethan mounted his horse one final time that evening, glancing back at the cabin as snowflakes drifted around the firelight. He felt a profound sense of resolution, a recognition that life's choices, however painful, were an opportunity for growth. In the cold winter light, the world felt both fragile and infinite, and he understood that this chapter, like the snow settling across the land, marked not an ending, but a beginning.